Good afternoon and good morning to everyone who's joined us for this panel on border carbon adjustments as part of the ICAP AIDA Virtual Pavilion. Thank you so much. I'm Chris Kardish with the ICAP Secretariat. My work is mostly in the ICAP Technical Dialogue workstream, which includes issues of carbon leakage and industrial decarbonization. Never before has there been more attention on how to design and implement a border carbon adjustment, which I'm going to refer to as a BCA instead of CBAM because it's shorter. Because for the first time, we have a government actively preparing a legislative proposal, in this case, the European Commission. So we'll be focusing today on the thorny issues the EU faces in putting together this proposal. So kind of diving in to the nitty gritty. Among them are compliance with World Trade Organization rules, rebates for EU exports, continued free allocation, deductions based on climate policies and jurisdictions of origin, and sectoral scope. So with me is a really excellent panel offering a mix of policy, trade law, and industry expertise. First, we have Eric Thérault, the Assistant Deputy Minister at the Quebec Ministry of the Environment and the Fight Against Climate Change, Frédéric Bonget, Deputy Head of the Carbon Markets Office at the French Ministry of Ecological Transition, Adolfo Aiello, Director of Climate and Energy at the European Steel Association, offering an industry perspective, and Emily Eriksson, Trade Policy Advisor at the National Board of Trade Sweden, offering us some trade law expertise when we get into this WTO stuff. So before we begin, I'll give a short introduction to border carbon adjustments to help ensure no one gets lost in the panel discussion. If there is time after this panel discussion, I would love to take questions from the audience. We'll see how much time we have. So without further ado, let me share my screen. So let's get into the basics, but let's start with a shameless plug for ICAP's work. So we're also engaged in this issue of border carbon adjustments through our carbon leakage and competitiveness working group as part of our technical dialogue work stream. Most recently, we've published a report in June 2020 on carbon leakage and deep decarbonization, reviewing free allocation to date across jurisdictions, leakage risk assessment, and exploring alternatives to free allocation, of course, border carbon adjustments among them, as well as complementary policies on the road to industrial decarbonization, like carbon contracts for difference, carbon product standards. And the BCA work, of course, focuses largely on key elements of design and trade-offs between effectiveness and administrative and legal feasibility. To start at the very beginning, the basics of what a border carbon adjustment is and why anyone would ever want to pursue one. Basic definition, they're tariffs or other fiscal measures on imports with the goal of eliminating differences in carbon costs between the implementing jurisdiction and trading partners. They could also be combined with rebates or exemptions for exports for the implementing jurisdiction with the same sort of purpose to eliminate differences between carbon costs when these exports are going to markets that don't put similar constraints on emissions. They've often been discussed in a way that the sectors under the border carbon adjustment would move to full auctioning because the instrument is designed to eliminate differences in carbon costs. However, though, there is discussion at the EU level about continuing free allocation in some form, which we will discuss in detail at this panel. The big issue of concern, of course, is compatibility with World Trade Organization rules. And this is in part because it's never been attempted. And so the boundaries are not entirely sure. And there's somewhat limited case law on which that we can make determinations about what is feasible. The key reasons for pursuing a border carbon adjustment, of course, is the issue of leakage protections for vulnerable sectors. But by leveling the playing field, the idea is of allowing both leakage protections in addition to the ability for industries to increasingly pass on the costs of compliance with an emissions trading system in their product prices, thereby better incentivizing the green transition and allowing them to, for instance, recoup the cost of investment and a host of other factors. Of course, the instrument would generate considerable revenue, which is already getting attention at the EU level. This could be directed toward technology innovation. And some would argue that there is a political window for this. I would see this as somewhat a quite debatable. Just given large differences in carbon pricing worldwide that are likely to continue in the future, and issues like setbacks in global trade liberalization more broadly. To bring us back into the EU context, we have climate neutrality endorsed by the European Council, and we're a few steps away from a higher 2030 target as a sort of an intermediate bridge to get to climate neutrality, both of which mean, of course, significant curtailing of free allocation budgets and potentially higher allowance prices, which elevates the issue of leakage on the agenda. The European Green Deal communication last year proposed a BCA should differences in levels of ambition worldwide persist. So there's sort of high level political backing. There was an inception impact assessment released in March 2020 that didn't offer us much in the way of the thinking about the ultimate design beyond not ever explicitly mentioning export rebates. But there's a full proposal expected in June 2021. Border carbon adjustments are quite complex. There's many design elements to consider. I'm going to focus on just a few of them that are worth thinking about for this panel discussion, and also just because they're kind of key to the effectiveness of a BCA. So first, trade flow coverage, fairly simple. Does the instrument just adjust for imports, or does it cover exports as well through rebates or exemptions? Of course, full coverage would enhance leakage protections for EU sectors with high exports, understandably. But this comes with the risk of WTO noncompliance, and I won't get into the reasons for that now. I'll leave this to later discussion. Another key issue is the emission scope. Does the instrument apply just to direct emissions from industrial processes? Does it also include indirect emissions from electricity inputs? This matters because, of course, electricity is considerable. Electricity costs are considerable in some industries, particularly aluminum. Including them could add a layer of complexity in terms of deciding how to benchmark for this, and potentially more risks of WTO noncompliance. But this also seems somewhat debatable. Then lastly, the determination of embedded carbon. So how do you actually base the adjustment on the carbon content of the good? How do you determine the carbon content of the good upon which to base the adjustment? The most ideal option, of course, would be making this at the sort of facility level based on verified emissions, so at the level of each installation. It would be the most accurate measure. It would be best for incentivizing abatement, but it's likely infeasible to require this of every foreign exporter to the EU. That means benchmarks are the likely fallback option, but of course benchmarks are always an imperfect approximation, and they could disadvantage EU producers if set too generously, especially if free allocation is discontinued. Some other considerations that'll be relevant for today's discussion on design and impacts of a BCA. This question of continuing free allocation is certainly going to be quite heated in the EU, and it's something we'll talk about today. It's sort of a key issue on the competitiveness side of this debate. On the issues of looking more internationally at issues of sort of due process and fairness to trading partners, there's this question of how do you allow foreign exporters to demonstrate their actual emissions intensity, to allow them to sort of lower their adjustment based on their actual performance? There's likely a need for such a mechanism. And then there's also likely a need for some sort of mechanism to credit foreign exporters for carbon pricing or other climate policies in their jurisdiction of origin. The latter, other climate policies, being far more challenging and a bit more questionable. Then lastly, of course, you have concerns about resource shuffling, which just refers to foreign producers essentially shifting their cleanest production to the EU because of the border carbon adjustment, while dedicating sort of less efficient production elsewhere. Then, of course, downstream impacts from sectors that are covered under the instrument. So sectors downstream from, say, cement and steel. And then, of course, other potential trade distortions because it is a trade policy instrument. For a very short primer on the WTO issues at play, because frankly, this issue requires a lot of additional reading. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is sort of the key legal text of WTO, has these two non-discrimination principles: most favored nation and national treatment. With most favored nation, basically just prevents or prohibits discrimination based on the country of origin of a particular good. National treatment, it basically requires that foreign products be treated no less favorably than their like domestic goods, with the question of like being key. There are exemptions to these non-discrimination principles possible through Article 20 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade for issues of environment and natural resources, which would be quite relevant in this case. But of course, it's not quite that simple because any such exemption still needs to abide by the so-called chapeau, which requires that this not be a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail, or a disguised restriction on international trade. Also of relevance here is the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures for issues of this export rebate issue. And all of this basically means that likely BCAs should avoid differentiating between trade partners based on country-specific characteristics, like their particular policies, or say in the case of benchmarks, it might be difficult to set benchmarks based on each individual exporter. It also means that you should likely account for their climate efforts, so existing carbon pricing. It also means that this mechanism should ensure fairness and due process, and it likely will need to be preceded by serious negotiations on the part of the EU. This environmental rationale needs to be a clear basis if there's any hope of getting an Article 20 exemption. And lastly, BCAs that exempt exports or are continuing free allocation certainly elevate legal risks at the very least. Okay. That was border carbon adjustments in 7 minutes. So with that, I would like to move to our panel. And I would like to start things off with a fresh perspective, since we are joined here by someone from Quebec, Eric Thiroux, the Assistant Deputy Minister at the Quebec Ministry for the Environment and Fight Against Climate Change. So to start us off, so as a subnational government that also has strong trading ties with the EU and your own ambitious climate policies, I'm just curious about how the prospect of a border carbon adjustment has been received in Quebec. So could you start us off?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks the ICAP for the organization of this panel. Obviously, since Quebec and California share the most comprehensive and effective cross-border ETS system, obviously we have quite an interest in the development of the EU BCA. And in this regard, we are welcoming the fact that the EU Commission is very receptive to a contribution by a sub-national government. And we think as Quebec government that consultation and collaboration among national and sub-national governments that have ETS systems or carbon pricing system is very key in the development of a BCA. And we should work all together to find, I would say, a sort of sustainable solutions, both for the challenges in regards to climate change and also in regards to the development of WTO rules and CETA. And I would say that Quebec, as an operator in the cap and trade system, we have it since 2013. we are very sensitive to the issue that the EU has put forward in alternative, I would say, to free allocations under the EU ETS. We are quite interested in this aspect because we will ourselves eventually face similar challenges within our own system. Because as the time go on, under our current free allocation process, number of the allowances provided for free will represent a greater share of annual emissions caps, thus limiting the sale of allowances and at auctions, while also threatening the capacity of the government to provide both free allowances to eligible emitters and also the impact that it has on the financing of the programs and measures. Because in Quebec, at least in our system, 100% of proceeds generated by the carbon market are put in the sort of green fund. And I would say as well that that's why, as soon as we have seen that the EU Commission was coming with such a proposal of the BCA, we made sure that we will be involved in the consultation process and had contact with the Commission. Quebec submitted a complementary brief in addition to our answers to the outline questionnaire. So it was also not only important for us, not only because of the principle of the BCA, but basically for trade purposes as well, because the EU is our second trade partner, just behind the United States. So basically, I would conclude by saying that the CBA, the carbon, is a carbon pricing initiative that we welcome in principle, and we want to make sure that they will represent or they will develop their initiative taking into account the opinion of subnational governments, because basically we have to recognize that some nationals are not only proactive, but quite often at the forefront of the fight against climate change in several countries. So, and it was and still the case with Quebec. So we welcome the initiative and are very grateful to the opportunity to comment on the CBE proposal.
Thank you much, Eric. It's also really great to get a subnational perspective on this, especially one that's so active in the environmental space. And in a follow-up question, we will dive a little bit deeper into so the implications of being a subnational and how you would fare in this whole system. To move to some WTO stuff, everyone's favorite subject, Emily, the Commission has said explicitly that it wants a WTO-compatible border carbon adjustment. The big question then in the room, so what are the WTO challenges with including rebates or exemptions for exports, especially for an ETS jurisdiction as opposed to, say, a carbon tax jurisdiction? Because I understand that there's certainly a very valid distinction.
Yes, indeed, and thanks, Chris, and it's a great pleasure being here on this panel. Well, the question, it boils down to the legal classification of a BCA, and most importantly, whether it would be considered a tax or an internal regulation under WTO law. So contrary to the US, where they're also discussing the introduction of a BCA at the same time as a carbon tax, in the EU, a BCA would most likely be linked to the EU's emission trading system. So it would most likely be expanded to include emissions caused by imported goods, so that the importer would probably be required to buy emission allowances equivalent to EU companies. So they wouldn't be explicitly required to pay a tax in the direct sense. And under WTO law, members may adjust both taxes and internal regulations at the border. And that means that they may impose the same taxes and or require the same requirements on imported goods as of domestic goods. However, only taxes may be rebated or exempted for exports. And this is regulated by the WTO's Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, the SCM agreement. And this has to do with the double taxation issues and the fact that goods shouldn't be taxed twice. However, there's no equivalent exception for internal regulations. So granting export rebates for internal regulations could constitute forbidden export subsidies under the SCM agreement. And this is not a problem that could be fixed by invoking the exceptions rules in the GATT either that you mentioned earlier, since those exceptions are not applicable on the SCM agreement. So the crucial question for the possibility of including rebates or exemptions for export for an ETS jurisdiction is whether the BCA would be considered a tax or an internal regulation under WTO law. And the National Board of Trade where I work, we wrote a report on this issue, which we published earlier this year. And our assessment is that it would be most natural, at least, to consider a BCA linked to the ETS as an internal regulation, and in particular, since we don't call it the system in the EU a tax. So it could be illegal to include export rebates. And also including export rebates might not be wise if you would like to invoke the exception rules in the GATT for other climate reasons when designing such an instrument. Because when you're doing the assessment under the exception rules, the entire measure is assessed and no element may question the climate purpose of the instrument.
Thank you very much, Emily. I was actually going to ask a follow-up on the Article 20 exception thing if it didn't come up. You got it all. Thank you so much. I guess so we're looking at this sort of constraints, and I kind of like to dive into what are the implications of that constraint. So to Frederic, if rebates for exports are likely off the table, what does that mean for the sectors that can be effectively covered under a BCA and those that would likely be proposed? I'm not asking you to predict the future about what would likely be proposed, but perhaps focusing on, the implications for what this means for the sectors that could be effectively covered.
So first, some element of context is this issue of export rebates. It's really one of the CBAM design with reallocation that will be the most discussed and the most debated on both sides of industry, NGOs, governments. It's really a sensitive topic, and CBAM without the export rebates will face really strong resistance from the industry. Would be harder to implement. I think the colleague from your affair can confirm that. On the French side, the French government, there is not really a position, a definite position, but it's what we say is that it needs to be examined, and we need to weigh the pros and cons, both on the legal side and the environmental side. And we need also to make sure that if there is a rebate, it keeps the incentive for European industry to go carbon neutral and not to keep business as usual for some exports and decarbonize for internal production. We, at the French level, we started a study to do a first assessment on the cost of border carbon adjustment. And I would like to share some order of magnitude. If we have full auctioning and no free allocation, the order of magnitude for most industries, it's a 5 to 10% increase in production costs or market costs. So that could be considered not very big, but it can be extremely significant if you compete on the price aspect.
Which of course is very relevant for these sort of industrial commodities.
Yes, so it's that's why it's really not trivial. And for the inclusion of sectors, I would say that one other aspect is that there is this export issue, but there is also the internal market that is important, and we cannot have also an internal market with different sectors competing on the same end market, like construction, for example, that one would have full auctioning and the other free allocation. There would be a distortion. So if we exclude one sector because there is no rebate, it has some serious implication on what other sectors we would include, and it would have also serious implication on the whole design of and the whole revenues of both CBAM and auctioning. And this revenue is also an important part of the puzzle, because it has been mentioned in the different councils that the EU is going to increase its own resources, and that carbon pricing and CBAM would be part of the equation.
Well, the internal market question doesn't make things simpler. I think you just added another layer of difficulty there. Thank you, Frederic. To move, perhaps it'd be good to bring in the industry here, actually. Adolfo, you've heard everything we've said so far. I'm wondering, I guess point blank, could the European steel industry support a border carbon adjustment that of course includes steel, but does not offer some sort of rebate or exemption for exports? And if not export rebates, what would it take to address the competitiveness concerns of steel under a BCA? Is that free allocation? Is that, what does that look like?
Thank you for the question, Chris. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
And thank you to the panelists, of course. Yes, while addressing your question, I just wanted to first clarify why I believe in this discussion on the CBA, why it is so strategic, and why in this discussion, industrial competitiveness and environmental integrity go absolutely hand in hand. As some of the panelists were hinting to, of course, there is a lot of international dimension in recent statements by third partners. But at the end of the day, what matters in the transition to climate neutrality is the timing, and in particular, the upcoming decade, which is a very important one for our sector. Because in the next decade, we will have, of course, the bulk of our production that will still be running with the conventional technologies. And for that, we will have compliance cost from the EU ETS. And on top of that, we will have, of course, the abatement cost to be covered in order to finance the investment in low carbon technologies. So from our perspective, the carbon leakage risk will be increased not only because of the unilateral increase in climate ambition by the EU, at least in the 2030 perspective, but also by the implications of the longer term strategy, because climate neutrality 2050 in sectors with such a long time horizon of investments actually requires investments several decades in advance, in particular in the coming decade. So for us, the CBA is an essential tool, is a complementary tool to the existing measures, at least in the upcoming decade, and it must be effective against carbon leakage. At the end of the day, since it needs to prevent leakage of emissions, so leakage of production in the coming decades, what is important to do when designing the CBA is to understand how the market dynamics of the different sectors work and design a measure that is effective in tackling these market dynamics. As we know, steel has always been considered as one of the sectors at highest risk, probably the sector at highest risk, because it is highly traded, highly energy intensive, low profitability. On top of the climate cost, there is also side elements which affect the market dynamics, overcapacities in third countries, subsidies, and so on. So let's say this combination of elements makes steel particularly sensitive to any cost difference. So before there was a reference to 5 to 10%, but actually in steel, even very tiny differences in prices can make a big difference. So from this perspective, we believe that at least in the short term, so in the short, medium term of the coming decade, the best way to design the CBA and to take into account all uncertainties that come with that is to design it as a complementary to the existing free allocation. We believe that with the current design of the ETS, this is doable still for several years. Of course, with some adjustments of the ETS, next year the Commission will, together with the CBA, will make proposals also on ETS revision. So the two things can go hand in hand. There can be a doable, let's say, interaction between the two measures, so that at least for some time the mechanism preserves the environmental integrity of the ETS and our competitiveness. And in this way, even if there is, let's say, this doubt about the export rebate, so going back about the essence of your question, we believe that at least by combining it with the free allocation, which is, I repeat, and I want to stress, is a very strict free allocation. It is based on the best 10% installation, so it is not a free lunch. Then it could deliver a good combination of incentives for our companies, but at the same time preserve competitiveness against imports. Thanks.
Thank you, Adolfo, for a very, very thorough answer on steel's cost sensitivity and a strong case for free allocation, or the BCA as a complement to free allocation. And to be clear to everybody joining, of course, there would need to be a methodology developed to sort of remove this value of free allocation from the adjustment that importers would face, and it would of course reduce the size of this adjustment. I would like to give everyone now on this panel a chance to respond to anything that was just said by anyone. Would anyone care to respond to something said by another panelist? And if not, I can move on to another round of questions. But first,
if I may,
yes, Adolfo.
Still about the export rebate and the environmental rationale of it. I think Emily was doubting about that. I would like to highlight the following aspect. Preserving the, let's say, the competitiveness of our exports in third markets is also a very important environmental measure, because any ton of steel that is produced in Europe and is exported to third countries is subject to the EU ETS. So it is subject to a cap on emissions, and ultimately it will have to be decarbonized quite soon, I would say, with climate neutrality 2050. So even if you grant a rebate on such an export, the fact that that export is still subject to the ETS, so with important cost under the EU ETS, does not undermine, I would say, the environmental rationale of the export rebate, because you are not, as I was saying before, you are not giving at all a free lunch. You are giving an expensive lunch, because free allocation is based on very strict benchmarks. So I would not exclude completely and easily the fact that an export rebate undermines the environmental rationale of climate policy. Thank you.
Eric, did you have something to say to
And
this?
just to simplify the question to Emily, do you think that in this context, that this initiative of BCA could help, I would say, rules to evolve for in the direction of a better consideration of environmental policies? Because if we, the EU cannot develop its project of BCA, having in mind the consideration that Adolfo mentioned, I fear that it will constrain states to former policies and that the world cannot evolve with a fair consideration of environmental factors and policies. So to which extent the development of the BCA will help WTO to evolve?
Yes, if I may just answer Adolfo's or comment on Adolfo's comment first, I do agree that there may be cases where exports rebates can have a climate purpose and be good for the climate, and if you can prove that, that might be justified under the general exception, but then you would really have to be able to prove that, and still I presume that the EU's trading partners would see it as a protectionist action in any case and try to argue that. So it can be problematic from that view. And as for Eric's comment, I do believe that the WTO law that it's possible to design a BCA that's compliant with WTO law, and I think the WTO law as it is right now, it's fit for handling climate measures. It's up to the lawyers to interpret it in the correct way. Now I don't remember if you asked me if it could help develop the WTO law as well, and that I'm not sure of, because that would require the entire membership to agree on new legislation, and I don't think we're really there right now.
It seems like
But
quite a lift.
maybe the panels could
Mhm.
help the members to evolve. if ever, since we've gotten a result in the US elections where the US will be in the position to appoint panelists, so we can hope that in the future we will have some sort of jurisprudence in this aspect.
Indeed.
Thank you, everyone. I think I'd like to move to the next round so we could potentially have some time for questions from the audience. It's ambitious to fit all this into an hour. So I guess actually, well, Emily, I hate to force you to talk again, but I did actually want to talk a bit more about, and yeah, it's fine to submit questions now in the chat, but I cannot promise we'll get to them. It would be at the very end. But just to sort of, because this talk of continuing free allocation and the border carbon adjustment being a complement, this will be certainly an argument that it's a complement to free allocation and not a replacement for it. What are the WTO implications of continuing free allocation under a border carbon adjustment? I guess put more bluntly, why would it be any safer than export rebates from a legal standpoint? Because it does often seem to be the case that we declare export rebates dead on arrival, but free allocation, this is feasible. Could you give us some clarity on that or some insights?
Yes, I'll try to do my best. So I just talked about how tricky it would be to include export rebates, and then for the question as regarding free allocation. So from a legal perspective, in order to comply with the non-discrimination obligations of the GATT, in particular the national treatment obligation, you can only require imported products to pay the same amount as domestic companies pay for the same type of product. So any additional amount would be discriminatory. So this means that when calculating how much the importer has to pay, if an EU product would be granted free allowances, the same cost reduction would also have to be granted to the same type of imported products. So it would be safer continuing with the reduced form of free allocation, since I mentioned earlier that export rebates could be illegal. But it would also mean that foreign products would have the same relief, and making foreign companies pay more than domestic companies would be contrary to the general rules of the GATT. And such a thing could not be justified by the general exceptions. And since justification for breaches must have a climate purpose and may not be for competitive reasons, it could, however, just as we talked about, be argued that since European products are on average more cleaner, it could be good for the climate that they are exported and sold on the global market, as they then would replace relatively more dirty goods. So if this could be proven, it could be okay. However, as I said earlier, it would probably be seen as a protectionist measure. There's also another hypothetical or a theoretical problem. Imagine, for example, if the EU companies are granted free allowances, and that the free allowances are withdrawn from the benchmark value used for calculating the emissions, and thus the cost for the imported products. In that case, you could risk discriminating imported products that may have been produced with cleaner means. So if the imported product have emitted less than the amount of free allowances allocated to European producers per good or weight, it could then at least theoretically require that the EU should pay the importer of the clean imported product.
That is quite a thorny question. But then the free allocation would not be considered part of the SCM agreement, the subsidies and countervailing measures. Would it not fall under that?
I haven't studied it in detail myself, and we didn't cover it in our report, but I know that some scholars have argued that free allowances could constitute actional subsidies under the SCM agreement. However, a country challenging such a subsidy would have to show that it has also been harmed, and this might be more difficult.
Okay, very interesting. And to move to another element of this debate that is also quite critical, this determination of embedded carbon. As I mentioned in the introduction, it will be, of course, difficult, but impossible, likely in the near term, to make this determination at the level of like individual shipments from individual facilities using verified emissions data. So, with that difficulty in mind, Frédéric, what's the most viable option for determining embedded carbon, and what are the shortcomings of this approach?
So on this issue, the proposition made by the French government in a non-paper is to have a system with a default value and to still offer some flexibility to importers to prove that they have a greener product. It helps to have a streamlined process for most of the shipments, but it's also important to have this flexibility to be WTO compliant in our point of view, because in the case where the product is better than the default value, it would not be discriminated against, and it would just prove that it can pay a smaller adjustment. So that's why we need some default values or benchmarks. In the EU sphere of discussion, usually when we talk about benchmarks, we talk about best performers, because that's how the free allocation works. But in this case of CBAM, we don't necessarily need to put the default value at the best performers. There is a debate that will be going on where is the most appropriate. If we put it too high, it will be I would say overprotective for EU industries, and it will also require possibly a lot of administrative work if most of the shipment show better performance. And if it's too low, it doesn't really protect efficiently from carbon leakage. So in our proposal, we suggest to use the EU average, but it's gonna be up for debate. And on the benchmark approach, the problem is that it's extremely work intensive and administratively intensive to set all these different benchmarks. But at least on the theoretical perspective, the more benchmark we have, the more precise we would be for the CBAM. I don't see on a theoretical point of view a shortcoming of having a big variety of benchmarks adapted to each product. It's more a question of feasibility, and that's also why to be practical, we would need to start with pilot sectors and pilot products, and maybe start for certain sectors with the most basic products, and include more semi-finished products and new benchmarks in the second step.
Thank you, Frédéric, for a very thoughtful take on benchmarking. And I know that the French government's been very active in thinking about these issues.
And sorry, one aspect I wanted to add also is what will be very important is to be extremely transparent on how the benchmark is defined, and especially what are the boundaries of the products, because it can really change the value of the benchmark. We are of course thinking about indirect emissions, but beyond indirect emissions, there is the issue of what inputs of the products are we taking into account to define this benchmark. And in the process of showing a better performance, it will also have to follow the same boundaries to show a better performance. And that's why we need to be very transparent, because we need to avoid situations where importers claim to have a better performance, but it actually has a different boundaries for his performance.
Thank you very much. To move again to the sort of international perspective, these key questions of fairness and due process for trading partners. The key questions, of course, are the carbon costs that producers face in their own jurisdictions, and in these cases when they perform better than whatever benchmark is applied. As a carbon pricing jurisdiction, I'm curious, what is the Quebec perspective on how to deal with these issues? How do you think this should be handled, Eric?
Very good question. And although the difficulties has been mentioned on the fact that it would be difficult to craft a measure that will take into account individual establishments, obviously in an ideal world for us, it would be important to maintain the incentive of individual establishment to innovate and reduce their carbon footprints, just as they are encouraged to in our ETS system. And that would be the best way, or the better way, to take into account the actual carbon content of the products these establishments export on the European market, and the actual level of carbon pricing they face in their own customs territory, and in our concern, including the carbon pricing of subnational government. And if that is not possible on the individual establishment, what we think is we would prefer that the BCA take into account, as precisely as possible the context of the first jurisdiction, the first local jurisdiction, whether it be subnational or national, where the production takes place by implementing the BCA. So in order to calibrate it to the territory and the export product. And one aspect that was not mentioned yet, unless I missed it, is the fact that we think that a consideration of the indirect emissions associated with the production of export products should be also included in the formula or in the design. Because, for example, in Quebec, whereas 99% of our electricity is renewable because it's hydroelectricity, it should be considered in the product that we export on the European market. And so in that way, the exporters from Quebec should have a benefit from the fact that our product is greener. We think that the BCA should promote also the adoption of a carbon pricing mechanism by outside EU government, including subnational government, in order to help align the different carbon prices levels around the world. It should be the European Union is at the forefront of the initiative worldwide. So, but it should be conceived in a way to get other jurisdictions on board with them. At the end of the day, for us, no matter how the BCA will be crafted, it's important to develop or to have an appeal mechanism by which an exporter will be able and allowed to challenge. For example, in Canada, we have so different levels of carbon pricing. I mean, if we have an ETS for Quebec, and obviously you don't have it in Alberta, the producers from and the production from Quebec should be allowed to appeal by a mechanism the estimation of carbon content, the level of carbon pricing that they are exposed to in order to compete in appropriate level in the European market. And lastly, as Frederic mentioned, it is very important that this process, the BCA should be both, I would say, transparent, as Frederic mentioned, but I would say easy to administer, both from an exporter perspective and importer perspective. Otherwise, it will introduce additional difficulties in worldwide trade trends. Hopefully the net result will be WTO in compliance with WTO rules, obviously. So it's very I mean, in terms of the development of policies, it's an amazing file. So I'm very looking forward for how the whole process will be developed in the European Commission level.
Thank you, Eric. And again, it's really good to have the perspective of a subnational carbon pricing jurisdiction to sort of also get into this question of what level of granularity do you look at when you're crediting policies, especially when it comes to carbon pricing, that's a very relevant consideration given the various levels at which this policy takes place.
And if I may add, the only aspect that I would have is that development will help us also to in the development of our own review of the free allowances scheme in Quebec too.
Yeah. I have one more question. I don't know that we'll have questions for time for questions from the audience, but I did want to come back to industry once again and kind of dive into some of these questions of competitiveness, because they are linked to carbon leakage, and we can't just brush them over. So Adolfo, I've read your position paper, your first position paper, and you guys raised a number of concerns One is that many foreign competitors would only face a carbon cost on their exports to the EU rather than all of production. And another, of course, is the potential for resource shuffling. Um, and I'm wondering, are these issues that can be solved through BCA design or other measures? Like, if so, how? Can it be done through the BCA? Other complementary measures, and how?
Yeah. Thanks. Indeed, here we are at, let's say, a different level of detail. We are really in the nitty-gritty details of the CBA. And I understand that from an academic point of view, let's say, there is a strong interest into the WTO compatibility. From a political point of view, from Eric's point of view, there is more the political perspective on it. As you can imagine, from an industry perspective, what we are interested in is in the effectiveness of the measure, because if it's WTO compliant and internationally accepted, but is not effective in tackling carbon leakage, we are afraid of being the patient after the surgery and the doctor says the surgery went well and the patient is dead. And we hope that we do not end up into that situation. But with regards to that resource shuffling, of course, steel is a complex sector, is by itself in different value chains. You find us in construction, in automotive, in machineries, and so on, almost everywhere in our daily life. So that's a first element to be taken into account. Second element is that we have different production processes, primary steel, secondary steel, with very different carbon footprint. So that's also an element to be taken into account. And then the third element, which is the obvious one, is that steel is globally traded. So it's produced a bit everywhere in the world. So on resource shuffling there, I think it will be important, like on many other aspects, to look at the details of the measure. We understand, let's say, in the Californian ETS, there is a general provision on prohibiting resource shuffling. We are afraid that in the context of the EU ETS, where we have so many products and materials, only a general provision would not be sufficient to avoid that, because we see different and many risks, actually. So I think one way of tackling that is, again, linked to what was said before, stretching a bit the boundaries of WTO rules and allow some form of control, not only on the carbon footprint of the products that are traded, but of all products of those partners that contribute and that interact in trading with the EU. Because a concrete example that we could have of resource shuffling is that you could have a company based in country A with two production facilities, one having a lower footprint and the other one having a higher footprint. If the company rationally exports only the first products, then of course this will have a free access to the European market, while in reality there is a carbon intensive material that is still being diverted somewhere else. So one of the ways, of course, it increases the complexity, we understand that, but we believe that it's inevitable for the effectiveness, is also to trace back the overall emissions of that company. We understand that this is, let's say, challenging from the point of view of trade law, but let's say, as a former trade law student, you know that with the jurisprudence, trade law has evolved a lot, you know, with the turtle, the dolphin, asbestos cases. There have been a lot of cases. And we believe that climate change is such an important topic that also deserves stretching the boundaries a bit of trade law, if the traditional boundaries of trade law are not sufficient for effective carbon leakage measures. Thank you.
And thank you. I'm now realizing that I'm over time, and I think we're sort of running into the final session, which is a plenary session, and I'll be in deep trouble if I divert attention from the final plenary. I'm sorry, everyone who did have questions. I think realistically, I wasn't sure we would be able to get to them. And I was honest from the beginning that I didn't think I'd be able to get to it. So I'm sorry. You could try to reach out to some of us by email if you have some follow-up questions. But I think I have to cut it off there. And I'd really like to thank all my panelists. We don't really have any time to dive into further debate on the responses you just all gave. But I thank you so much for joining. And yeah, thanks for your attention.